So we have this new use class, as we've been saying, and it basically is everything that we have said before. It is really key that the government want to have this very clear scenario where it's kind of, oh, Naomi, yes, very good. I'm going to come back to that. So it doesn't mean that the 90 days will be no more. It just means on that first day, everyone will be the same. So yeah, so everyone has this C5 introduction. Let me just so the C5 introduction. So we're all going to be the same. We're all going to have it. If you currently run as service accommodation, short-term let, and you fall into these categories, then you can have C5. But then what we have is we move into what is called the permitted development. Now, we understand that we will get permitted development rights. What does that mean? Okay, so what that means is, let's say you've got your home, and for want of a better description, you've actually bought a second home or whatever, and you're left with that home. What are you going to do with it? You've now been running it for a couple of years as a holiday let. It's doing really well for you, and you want to kind of continue. So you would, in the new world, be able to make use of the permitted development. So you are permitted to change the use class from C3, the dwelling house, to C5, the short-term let. And let's say then at the end of that period, 2 years, you suddenly go, you know what? We actually think we would like to utilize those funds for a bigger project. We want to sell a load of properties and actually accumulate the funds for a bigger project. So actually, we'd like to sell it. Well, at that stage, you've got a C5. And maybe, and again, we don't know what it's going to be like in the future, do we? Maybe it would be better to sell that property as a C3 dwelling house. Maybe it really just works for a house, and it may reduce your market. And again, we don't know in the future, it may increase the value of it. But at the moment, there is probably going to be a bigger market, for instance, for a 3-bed house, in just people wanting to go and live there and have it as their own house. So they are going to want to purchase it as a C3, your own home, not as a C5, as a short-term let. So this permitted development allows you to go from C3 to C5, but then equally, it allows you just to go back again. So it is, really, really useful to know that basically you can go from one to the other, and it shouldn't really make too much difference in this scenario. Now, one of the things that is kind of a bit of a concern for some, and I think this is definitely needs to be raised, there isn't anything that has talked about HMO to serviced accommodation or to short-term rental. So it would seem that if you currently have a C4 HMO or a sui generis HMO, so a much bigger HMO, to get to C5, it looks like you will potentially need planning permission. So just remember, this still is not in place. This is something that is looking to come in the summer of 2024. So if you haven't got, if at the moment you're okay, but potentially you may need to get actual planning permission, whereas with permitted development you don't need to get actual planning permission. Now, the only thing that is, again, a bit of an unknown is we haven't been told whether we need prior approval or prior notification to get C3 to C5 from your home to a short-term rental property. So what does that mean? If you do need prior approval, that basically means you have to be able to tick a checklist, so to speak, of things that make it possible for you to change from C3 to C5. Again, it would be a certain number of things, and if you can tick those, you put it into your local council's planning, and if they don't come back to you within so many days, you can just go ahead and do that, because you've proven that you've ticked everything that's required for this prior approval. And if they don't come back to you within so many days, you can just go ahead and do it, and you've got that proof there. If they do come back to you, then obviously you would follow up to do whatever they say. At the moment, this has not been mentioned so much. We only hear about permitted development. We haven't actually had this kind of prior approval. So again, that's still an unknown. So that's something for us to be there. So this comes back to Naomi's kind of question about Article 4. So if anyone understands an Article 4 direction, if you know anything about HMOs, you will hear that all around the country, certain areas have something called an Article 4 direction. And what that means is, where normally you can have permitted development, so like we talked about, you are just allowed to change one use class to another. So you can, in most of the country, you can change C3, your own home, to C4, a small HMO. Okay, so you don't need to do anything, so to speak, as in apply for planning. It is permitted development that you're allowed to do that. However, in some areas, so similar to why this serviced accommodation stuff's brought in, there is let's say too many HMOs, and they feel that they're just taking away normal family houses. So therefore they've brought in this restriction, which is known in generic terms as the Article 4 direction. And actually, when you have that, you cannot do C3 to C4. You actually have to make a planning application to kind of get over this. So most of the country currently do not have any restrictions for serviced accommodation, except a couple of places. Okay, so as Naomi has said, we have the 90-day rule, or the 90 days restriction in London. So on day one of this coming in, everyone across the country has exactly the same. So they will all have this permitted development rights. But because London already has a restriction, they will basically immediately be able to introduce an Article 4 direction, because they already had those restrictions beforehand. Yeah. So basically, they're not suddenly adding on a new restriction to all those people in their area. These people already are used to it. They're already doing it on a day-to-day basis. So it seems, doesn't it, perfectly fair that on day one, the law, or, the new planning rules come out, and London will be allowed basically to pop in their Article 4 restriction, because it's already what's been done before. But there are other areas, so Cornwall have some restrictions. So again, they would be, it would seem normal that they would be allowed to do that. But it is unlikely that just a totally new area that has no restrictions, when the new use class comes in, that they suddenly put in an Article 4 restriction, because that can cause a lot of issues, can't it? That could cause a lot of problems for local businesses, for serviced accommodation providers, all of these things. And actually, they can be kind of charged potentially for these things. So generally, and again, this is a generalization, and I know it's something that Jonathan McDermott talks about, is that you are going to be waiting kind of generally about a year to get a new Article 4 into place, to give everyone that chance to kind of understand it. So generally, if your area currently has no restrictions around serviced accommodation or short-term rental. And obviously in the summer, this new permitted development comes in where you have a C3 dwelling, your own home or whatever, could be changed to C5, then there should be no restrictions. But they might want to bring in restrictions, but you will have a period of time where they basically have to, you know, get it passed or whatever and ensure that they can bring in it. So generally, if you currently don't have a restriction in your area, when this comes in, it is unlikely that you will get this Article 4 restriction direction coming in immediately. So there will be this kind of delay, but of course there will be some areas that kind of bring it in. I know there's some areas that have brought in Article 4. I've got one near me. I'm not entirely sure why they brought it in. It doesn't really seem to be pertinent, but I do know that they had a few complaints and they just kind of brought it in to keep everyone, well, to keep the few complainers happy. Is that right or wrong? That's not really for us to comment. So